My name is Nora. I'm somewhere in my 30s now, old enough to know when a moment will change you, young enough to still remember exactly who I was before it did. I've spent most of my adult life inside systems, corporate ones mostly, where performance reviews are tidy, language is careful, and the real power dynamics live quietly between meetings. If you met me back then, you probably wouldn't have clocked me as someone with a dramatic story. I wasn't loud. I wasn't the sharp-elbowed climber. I didn't dominate rooms or collect allies. I was the person people trusted with the unglamorous things, the details, the follow-through, the work that needed to be right but didn't need to be seen. Reliable, calm, easy to overlook. And that's usually how I was underestimated. People assume my silence meant agreement, that my consistency meant compliance, that because I didn't interrupt, I didn't notice. Because I didn't escalate, I didn't understand leverage. I was often described as solid, supportive, low maintenance, compliments that sound positive until you realize they come with an invisible ceiling. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing villains or humiliating anyone. It's about a sequence of very ordinary events that led to a very precise ending, an ending that, from the outside, looked sudden, almost shocking, but from the inside felt inevitable. I was named Employee of the Year, then fired 72 hours later. And the timeline matters. The award photo went live on Monday. My access was cut on Thursday at 9:07 a.m. Those facts are true. What's more interesting is everything around them. The weeks and months of normalization that made that moment possible, the quiet calculations happening while everyone else was celebrating, and the internal shift that happened long before anyone else realized something had changed. Over the next parts, I'll walk you through how I was seen, how I allowed certain roles to settle around me, and how silence, first reflexive, then intentional, became a form of control rather than submission. This is a story about emotional justice, not in the sense of punishment, but in the sense of alignment. Things ending exactly when they should. I won't dramatize conversations or exaggerate motives. I'm not here to rewrite anyone as a cartoon villain, including myself. I'll tell you what happened, how it felt, and what I learned when I realized that being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it's a position. If you've ever been quietly relied upon, subtly diminished, or praised in ways that kept you small, you might recognize parts of yourself here. And if you've ever watched something end and only later understood that it had been decided long before the final moment, then you already know the kind of story this is. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever sensed that a chapter of your life was closing before anyone else noticed? In the office, I existed in a very specific way. Not invisibly, because people did see me, but functionally, like infrastructure. Something essential that fades into the background once it's working properly. I was the person whose name came up when something broke and disappeared again once it was fixed. I wasn't ignored, I was assumed. Assumed to stay late if a deadline slipped, assumed to take notes when meetings got chaotic, assumed to smooth things over when personalities clashed. And because I did those things well, consistently, and without complaint, that assumption hardened into expectation. When new managers joined, my introduction was always the same. Nora knows how things actually work. It sounded like respect. It felt like permanence, like being quietly anchored to a spot no one else wanted, but everyone depended on. I sat in meetings where decisions were discussed around me, even when they directly affected systems I had built. People would look up halfway through and say, "Oh, Nora, does that timeline make sense?" And I would nod, or gently adjust it, and the conversation would move on, unchallenged, uninterrupted. I wasn't part of the narrative. I was part of the mechanics. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't hurt at first. It feels safe, predictable. You're not threatened because you're not perceived as competition. You're not scrutinized because you're not seen as volatile. You're trusted, up to a point. That point is visibility. I learned early that being calm made others comfortable, that not reacting gave people space to project competence onto me without feeling challenged. So I became very good at listening more than speaking, at choosing precision over presence. Performance reviews reflected this perfectly. Dependable, consistent, low drama, team player, always strong ratings, always vague praise, never momentum. I watched colleagues with louder styles fail upward, praised for leadership presence after projects I quietly stabilized. I watched ideas I'd floated in one-on-ones resurface later in meetings, delivered by someone else, received as insight. And still I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't notice, because I was still deciding what noticing meant. At the time, I told myself a story that made staying comfortable, that reliability would eventually be rewarded, that depth mattered more than optics, that if I kept my head down and my standards high, recognition would come naturally. It's an easy story to believe when no one is actively hurting you. No one yelled, no one insulted me, no one undermined me publicly. The absence of cruelty can feel like safety, even when growth has stalled. To them, I was the steady one, the adult in the room, the person who would never cause friction. And that was the role I played so well that it became the only one they could see. I didn't realize yet that roles, once assigned, are rarely reconsidered voluntarily, or that being essential and being replaceable can coexist in the same breath until someone decides to test that assumption. At this stage, there was no anger in me, no plan, just a quiet awareness that I was being measured by how little I disrupted, not by how much I contributed. I didn't resist it. I absorbed it. And that absorption, slow, unremarkable, almost invisible, was the foundation for everything that followed. The first moment that stayed with me was so minor that I almost talked myself out of remembering it. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that blends into every other week. A status meeting. 12 people on a video call, cameras half on, half off. I had spent the previous 2 weeks untangling a reporting issue that no one could quite define, but everyone was anxious about. Late nights, careful documentation, a clean fix that didn't draw attention to how fragile the system had been. When the issue was resolved, my manager summarized it in one sentence. Looks like the reporting inconsistency resolved itself. I remember the phrasing because it landed strangely in my body. Not sharply, not painfully, just wrong. Like watching something slide out of alignment by a few millimeters. No one corrected it, no one asked how. The meeting moved on. Afterward, a colleague messaged me privately. Nice save on the reports. That was the pattern. Public ambiguity. Private acknowledgement, praise that never accumulated into record. I told myself it didn't matter. That impact was impact, whether named or not. That I didn't need credit to feel secure in my competence. But something had been nicked. A few weeks later, there was another moment. This one smaller. A project update deck that included several metrics I maintained. My name wasn't on it, not unusual, but a new analyst was listed as point of contact for questions. I asked neutrally if that was intentional. Oh, my manager said, you're still the backbone here. We just want to give them exposure. Backbone, exposure. As if those were equal currencies. Everyone else accepted that explanation immediately. I did too, outwardly. I smiled, nodded, said it made sense. And it did, on paper. But inside, I started to notice how often "it makes sense" was used to justify decisions that always cost the same person. Me. The cuts weren't dramatic, they were procedural. A decision made quickly, a credit line omitted, a responsibility shifted without authority attached. Each one was easy to rationalize on its own. Taken together, they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. Still, I stayed quiet. There's a specific pressure that comes with being seen as reasonable. You don't want to be the person who suddenly isn't. You don't want to introduce discomfort where none appears to exist, especially when the system around you rewards smoothness, not friction. So I filed the moments away. Mentally at first, then later, physically. In my notebook, dates, context, language used, not accusations, just facts. I told myself it was for clarity, for perspective, so I wouldn't overreact. And that was true. What I didn't admit yet was that part of me was already adjusting, shifting from participant to observer, from trusting the system to studying it. The strange thing about small cuts is that they don't bleed. They don't demand response. They don't invite intervention. They just change how you move afterward, how carefully you step, how aware you become of where the edges are. No one around me noticed anything had changed. Why would they? I still delivered, still answered questions, still absorbed pressure quietly. From the outside, I looked exactly the same. From the inside, something subtle had begun. A recalibration of how much of myself I was willing to offer without reciprocity. Not anger, not resentment, awareness. And once awareness sets in, it doesn't go away just because everyone else is comfortable pretending nothing happened. At the time, I couldn't have told you where this was heading. I didn't know it would matter. I just knew I was paying attention now in a way I hadn't before. That was the first small cut, and it taught me something important. If something costs you and no one else even notices the loss, it's worth asking why you're the one absorbing it. Once you start noticing patterns, they have a way of accelerating. What surprised me wasn't that the small dismissals continued. It was how quickly they became normal. Not just to everyone else, but to me. I adjusted faster than I realized. Meetings began to follow a familiar rhythm. I would be asked for input at the end, once decisions were mostly shaped. My role was no longer to influence direction, but to validate feasibility. I became the person who made other people's ideas workable, not the one whose ideas set the course. When timelines were praised, the credit went to great cross-team alignment. When problems were avoided, it was because process maturity is improving. Language without ownership, success without names. I told myself this was just how organizations worked, that not everyone needed the spotlight, that someone had to be the stabilizing force, and because I was good at that, it made sense that it was me. That's how normalization works. You explain away the imbalance until it feels neutral. There was a moment when a senior leader joined one of our reviews and asked casually, "So who actually owns this workflow?" My manager answered without hesitation, "Nora keeps it running. Not owns, keeps it running." I remember nodding along the way you do when you don't want to correct someone in front of authority. I told myself I could clarify later. Later never came. What did come were more expectations layered on top of the same recognition vacuum. I was looped into escalations, but not strategy. Trusted with sensitive fixes, but excluded from planning sessions where those fixes could have been prevented. Each time I chose silence. Part of that was habit. Part of it was fear. Not of confrontation, but of being reframed. I'd seen what happened to people who pushed too hard for visibility. They were labeled political, difficult, not a culture fit. Meanwhile, my reputation was spotless, dependable, easy. I protected that reputation like it was an asset, because at the time, it was the only one I thought I had. So when my workload quietly increased without title or compensation shifting, I adjusted. When junior colleagues were encouraged to own pieces of work I still maintained, I supported them. When my contributions were summarized without attribution, I let it go. I became fluent in minimizing myself. Not dramatically, not painfully, just efficiently. There's a dangerous satisfaction in being the person who can absorb more than others. You feel capable, resilient, necessary, and as long as no one is explicitly crossing a line, it's easy to tell yourself you're choosing maturity. But maturity without boundaries slowly turns into erasure. I noticed it most in how people spoke to me versus how they spoke about me. Direct conversations were warm, appreciative. Indirect ones, Slack threads, decks, leadership summaries, flattened my presence into function. I existed as a verb, not a noun. Still, I rationalized. I told myself this was temporary, that seasons of invisibility preceded recognition, that staying quiet was strategic, even if I wasn't yet sure what the strategy was. And maybe part of me believed that if I just kept being excellent, the system would correct itself. Systems don't correct themselves. They optimize for what they already reward. By staying silent, by continuing to deliver without friction, I was teaching everyone exactly how to treat me. I was making it easy for them to assume I would always be there, always compensate, always smooth the edges. The hardest part to admit is this: no one forced me into that role. I accepted it over and over because it felt safer than disrupting the equilibrium. Respect rarely disappears all at once. It thins, it dilutes, until one day you realize you're being managed more than valued. By the end of that period, the disrespect wasn't loud. It was procedural, embedded, normal. And because it was normal, it was invisible. To them, not to me. I didn't push back yet. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even change my tone. What I changed was where I placed my attention. Because once you stop believing the story that keeps you quiet, you start noticing the role you've been assigned and whether you're willing to keep playing it. The realization didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as a clarification. I wasn't misunderstood. I was correctly understood, just not in the way I had imagined. The role I occupied in the organization was clear, consistent, and useful. It just wasn't expansive. I was the stabilizer, the person you lean on when things wobble, the one you trust to fix what breaks without asking uncomfortable questions about why it broke in the first place. I made other people look competent by absorbing complexity quietly. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction reinforced it. When projects were discussed, I was consulted on execution, not vision. When priorities shifted, I was informed, not included. My value lived in reliability, not leadership. And reliability in corporate structures is rarely rewarded with power. It's rewarded with more responsibility. The language people used around me was affectionate but limiting. Nora will handle it. She's great at keeping things moving. We don't have to worry if Nora's on it. None of those statements were false. That's what made them dangerous. They framed me as a constant, something you plan around, not something that evolves. I noticed how often my name was used to reassure others, never to advocate for me. I was the answer to risk, not a candidate for opportunity. What struck me most was how comfortable everyone seemed with this arrangement, including me for a long time, because the role came with its own rewards. Autonomy without visibility, trust without scrutiny. I could work deeply, quietly, without interference. No one micromanaged me, no one questioned my judgment. In exchange, I stayed out of the spotlight. It was a fair trade until it wasn't. The moment it stopped being fair was when I realized the role wasn't temporary. It was structural, and no one had any incentive to change it. I wasn't being prepared for advancement. I was being preserved for continuity. That's when a different kind of awareness settled in. Not resentment, not urgency, just clarity. If I continued as I would always be the reliable constant. The person whose absence would cause chaos, but whose presence would never be celebrated loudly enough to protect her. That's the paradox of being essential without authority. You're trusted with everything and protected by nothing. I looked around and saw how others were allowed to experiment, to fail visibly, to be coached and promoted. Their growth was part of the narrative. Mine was assumed to be complete. And again, I didn't confront anyone. There was no dramatic moment where I stood up for myself. That kind of confrontation wouldn't have worked anyway. It would have sounded like surprise when everyone else thought the arrangement was obvious. Instead, I adjusted my internal posture. I stopped assuming my role would be recognized organically. I stopped assuming silence was neutral. I stopped assuming that being indispensable meant being safe. What I hadn't done yet was decide what to do with that understanding. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer trying to prove my value to the system. I was studying the system to understand where my value actually sat and how fragile it was. That's a different way of seeing. Quieter, colder, more precise. And once you see your role clearly, you're faced with a question you can't avoid forever. Do you continue performing it perfectly? Or do you prepare for what happens when it no longer serves you? At that point, I was still performing, but I had stopped believing. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no email that changed everything. It was a pause, a small, almost imperceptible moment where I realized my internal alignment had changed, and there was no going back. It happened during a quarterly planning session, one of those long meetings where strategy is discussed in broad strokes and details are deferred to offline follow-ups. I was there as usual to validate feasibility, to translate ambition into something workable. At one point, a leader outlined a new initiative that would lean heavily on systems I had designed and maintained. Timelines were aggressive, dependencies were vague, risk was acknowledged but brushed aside. Someone asked, "Can we pull this off?" The room went quiet for a beat, then several heads turned toward me. This was my moment to speak, to explain the constraints, to outline what would need to change, to protect the system and indirectly the company from overpromising. I felt the familiar reflex rise in me, the urge to smooth, to make it work, to say yes if we're careful. And then something else surfaced, a simple question, fully formed, calm, unavoidable. Why am I protecting a system that does not protect me? I didn't feel angry, I felt clear. So instead of filling the silence with reassurance, I said evenly, I'd need to review the assumptions. I can't confirm that timeline as is. That was it. One sentence, no edge, no explanation. The meeting moved on. No one challenged me. No one asked follow-up questions. And that, strangely, was the moment. I realized that my constant availability, my habit of absorbing uncertainty, had been doing more than supporting the work. It had been shielding leadership from consequences. As long as I stepped in, pressure never traveled upward. By pausing, by not immediately compensating, I felt the balance shift, not outwardly, internally. After the meeting, I didn't rush to follow up. I didn't send the usual clarifying email. I didn't outline scenarios or propose workarounds. I just sat with the discomfort. It was subtle, but powerful. For the first time, I allowed a gap to exist between expectation and delivery. And nothing collapsed. The world didn't end. People adjusted. That's when I understood something I had never fully let myself consider. My silence had been automatic before. Now it was becoming deliberate. The shift wasn't about withholding effort. It was about withdrawing unpaid protection. I went home that evening and opened my notebook. I didn't write about feelings. I wrote about structures, about where decisions were made, where accountability stopped, and where it quietly pooled, usually at my desk. I wasn't planning an exit. Not yet. I wasn't even planning a confrontation. I was recalibrating. That day marked the end of my unconscious loyalty. From that point on, I stopped defaulting to preservation. I began observing consequences without rushing to soften them. It's a strange thing, realizing that you've been acting as a buffer for so long that the system feels exposed without you. But once you see that, you can't unsee it. And you can't unknow the power that comes from simply stepping back just enough to let reality speak for itself. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, something I defaulted to in order to keep things moving smoothly. Now it was intentional, measured, chosen. I still spoke when asked. I still did my job. But I stopped preempting problems that weren't formally acknowledged. I stopped filling gaps that no one had assigned to me. I let questions linger instead of answering them before they were fully formed. And almost immediately, people misread it. My quiet was interpreted as agreement, my restraint as flexibility. The same behaviors that had once been praised as maturity were now taken as proof that nothing had changed. That misinterpretation worked in my favor, because while they assumed I was still absorbing, I was observing more clearly than ever. I noticed how often decisions were made on incomplete information, trusting that someone, usually me, would correct course later. I noticed how accountability diffused upward only when consequences became visible. I noticed how comfort depended on my presence, but authority did not include me. I didn't challenge any of this. I documented it. Dates, meetings, decisions, outcomes. Not to build a case, at least not consciously, but to understand the system's patterns when unprotected. The irony was that the less I intervened, the more competent everyone felt. Problems were framed as growing pains. Delays were blamed on external factors, and when something truly broke, the question was never, why was this allowed, but who can fix it? The answer, inevitably, was still me. And I did fix things, selectively, within scope, within assignment, without overextending. I stopped donating labor that existed only because expectations had quietly expanded. That boundary wasn't announced, it was enacted. No one confronted me about it. That's the thing about informal contracts. They're only enforceable as long as one party keeps honoring them. When I stopped, there was confusion, but not outrage. No one could point to a rule I'd broken. Externally, I remained the same calm presence. Internally, I was testing something important. What happened when I let the system experience its own friction? The answer was subtle and revealing. Meetings ran longer, decisions were deferred. Leaders began to ask more clarifying questions, just not of me directly. They were adjusting, but they hadn't identified why. Meanwhile, my reputation remained intact because I hadn't become loud. I hadn't complained. I hadn't escalated. I was still reasonable, still composed. Silence, when chosen, is difficult to argue with. It doesn't provoke defensiveness. It doesn't create sides. It simply removes support. That's when I understood that power doesn't always come from speaking up. Sometimes it comes from no longer compensating. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was watching how long it would take for someone to notice that a role had shifted. What I didn't realize yet was that by stepping back, I was also revealing something else. How little formal recognition protected the people doing the most informal work. I was still seen as dependable, still praised in passing, still assumed to be steady. But I was no longer invested in being indispensable. And that distinction, small, internal, almost invisible, was what made everything that followed possible. Because once silence becomes a choice, it becomes leverage. Not in a dramatic way, in a structural one. And structures respond to pressure, whether or not anyone understands where it's coming from. While everything on the surface stayed the same, something quieter was happening underneath. I began preparing, not in the way people imagine preparation. There was no secret job search tab open on my laptop during meetings, no whispered complaints, no emotional venting to colleagues. What I was doing was slower, more methodical, and far less visible. I was learning exactly how the system relied on me, not theoretically, practically. I mapped processes I'd inherited years earlier and gradually absorbed until no one remembered where they started. I noted which reports only I could reconcile without cross-checking 3 sources, which automations required context that was never written down, which vendor relationships defaulted to my inbox because I was the only one who responded clearly and consistently. I noticed how often people said, "We should document this," and how rarely it happened because the system worked as long as I was there to interpret it. So I documented, for myself. Not in shared folders, not in official wikis, in my notebook, in private files. Clear, factual, unemotional records of what I owned, what I touched, and what broke when I wasn't involved. This wasn't hoarding knowledge. It was understanding leverage. At the same time, I started paying attention to language. Not what people said to me, but how they described my work when I wasn't in the room. The phrases that minimized ownership. The way responsibility was framed as collective until something went wrong. I also noticed what wasn't being done for me. No succession planning, no backup assigned, no cross-training scheduled. I was considered stable enough not to need any of that. That stability was assumed to be permanent. What they never noticed was how deliberately I had become replaceable in spirit, while remaining irreplaceable in structure. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't refuse work dramatically. I simply stopped expanding. And because I had spent years over-delivering, the reduction still looked like excellence. I also began quietly educating myself, not in ways that showed up on resumes, but in ways that clarified my position. Employment law, internal policy language, the difference between praise and protection. the gap between being valued culturally and being protected contractually. I learned what documentation mattered and what didn't, what conversations needed summaries, which approvals were implied versus explicit. None of this raised alarms. Why would it? I wasn't acting out. I was still calm, still professional, still, in their eyes, the same Nora. That was the blind spot. People assume preparation looks like agitation. They expect withdrawal to be visible. They don't recognize quiet alignment until it's complete. What they also never noticed was that I had stopped centering my identity on the role. I did my work well, but I no longer fused my sense of worth to how necessary I felt. That shift alone changed everything. I was no longer asking, how do I keep this working? I was asking, what happens if it doesn't? And once you ask that honestly, you start seeing how fragile many stable arrangements actually are. By the time anyone sensed a difference, it wasn't because I had changed visibly. It was because the system had begun to reveal its dependence. And dependence, when unacknowledged, is the most dangerous place to stand. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no email, no meeting, no sudden discovery that made my heart race. It arrived quietly, the way real clarity often does, through accumulation, through noticing the same pattern from enough angles that denial becomes impossible. It happened late one evening when I was reviewing my notes, not for any immediate reason, just organizing, refining, making sense of what I had already recorded. That's when I saw it. Not a single point of failure, but a convergence. I realized that several of the systems I maintained weren't just operationally important, they were structurally exposed. They depended on historical knowledge that existed nowhere formally. Decisions made years earlier, exceptions layered on top of exceptions. Logic that only made sense if you remembered why it had been built that way. And I was the only one who did. That alone wouldn't have mattered if there had been redundancy, or documentation, or even acknowledgement of risk. There wasn't. The private reveal was this: my value to the organization was real, but informal. An informal value disappears the moment it becomes inconvenient. I could be praised publicly and removed quietly, celebrated symbolically and replaced procedurally. There was nothing contradictory about that. In fact, the more I understood the structure, the more obvious it became. I wasn't protected by my indispensability. I was exposed by it. Because if something went wrong at the wrong time, if a decision needed a clean break, a budget needed trimming, a narrative needed simplifying, the safest person to remove would be the one whose work was invisible to leadership but essential to function. Me. That realization didn't make me anxious. It made me calm. I stopped thinking in terms of loyalty and started thinking in terms of alignment. I asked myself one clear question: if this ends suddenly, am I positioned to land cleanly? The answer at first was no, so I corrected that quietly. I ensured my personal records were complete. I saved copies of my performance reviews. I documented praise when it occurred. I noted discrepancies between language used privately and publicly, not to weaponize, to understand. I also stopped assuming good intent would translate into fair treatment. I didn't assume bad intent either. I simply accepted that systems act in their own interest, and people inside them often confuse comfort with ethics. That acceptance was freeing. The private reveal wasn't about power over others, it was about power over my own exposure. Once I saw where the risk actually sat, I could choose how and when to step out of it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. Because clarity doesn't excite you. It steadies you. And once you're steady, you can make decisions without urgency, without fear, without needing anyone else to validate the timing. By the time I closed my notebook that night, I knew something fundamental. This wasn't going to end on their terms alone. It would end cleanly, precisely, and without noise. I just hadn't chosen the moment yet. Once you see clearly, you can't pretend you don't. That's the quiet pressure of clarity. It doesn't rush you, but it doesn't release you either. It waits. I entered what I now think of as the decision window. Nothing external marked its beginning. No deadline, no ultimatum. Just the awareness that continuing exactly as I was would eventually cost me more than leaving on my own terms. I had options. I listed them carefully. I could speak up, request a title change, negotiate scope, force visibility. That path required belief in a system that had already shown me its limits. It also required emotional energy I no longer wanted to spend convincing people of what I'd already demonstrated. I could leave quietly, find something else, exit cleanly before anything broke. That option was tempting, but it felt incomplete. Like walking away without understanding the full shape of what I was stepping out of. Or I could stay, fully aware, fully prepared, and let the system reveal itself without my interference. That was the irreversible option. Not because it was dramatic, but because it meant I would no longer intervene to protect outcomes that excluded me. I would do my job, honor my responsibilities, and stop managing other people's risk for free. I chose the third. It wasn't a decision made out of bitterness, it was made out of alignment. I wanted to know definitively whether the organization valued me as a person or merely as a function. And the only way to learn that was to stop buffering the difference. Once I chose that path, my behavior didn't change much. That's what made it effective. I still met deadlines, still answered questions, still delivered quality work. What I stopped doing was absorbing ambiguity. If something wasn't clearly assigned, I didn't assume ownership. If a decision lacked context, I asked for it. If a risk wasn't acknowledged, I didn't quietly mitigate it. None of this was confrontational. It was procedural. Internally, though, I crossed a line. I accepted that this might end with my removal. Not as a fear, but as a possibility I was prepared for. That acceptance gave me something rare, patience. I no longer needed reassurance. I no longer needed praise. I no longer needed to be seen. I just needed to stay precise. And then, unexpectedly, recognition arrived. Not the kind that changes outcomes, but the kind that decorates them. Nominations, compliments, a sudden increase in visible appreciation, language that felt warmer, broader, more public. It would have been flattering if I hadn't already understood the timing. When systems sense instability, they often respond with symbolism. Awards are cheaper than structural change. Praise is easier than protection. I received it calmly, graciously, without attachment, because by then the decision had already been made, not about leaving, about no longer preventing the truth from surfacing. And once that decision is made, the rest is just sequence. By the time I began moving in silence, nothing inside me felt rushed. That's important because urgency leaves fingerprints. It sharpens tone. It tightens posture. People can sense it even when they don't know what they're sensing. I didn't want to be sensed. I wanted to be misread. So I slowed down. Externally, I became even more composed, even more steady. If anything, I appeared settled, comfortable in my role, appreciative of recognition, unbothered by ambiguity. I thanked people for kind words. I smiled in meetings. I accepted praise without deflection, without leaning into it. Internally, I was executing a quiet disentanglement. The first thing I did was audit my own exposure. Not emotionally, structurally. I reviewed my employment agreement line by line, not with suspicion, but with literacy. I noted notice periods, termination language, clauses that sounded mutual but weren't. I compared policy to practice. What was written versus what was assumed. I didn't flag anything. I didn't ask HR hypothetical questions. I simply learned the terrain. At the same time, I began clarifying boundaries that had never been formalized. Not by refusing work, but by responding with precision. When asked to just take a look at something outside my scope, I asked what decision it supported. When looped into escalations, I asked who owned the final call. When timelines were implied, I asked for confirmation. Each question was reasonable. Each one forced ownership upward without sounding defensive. What surprised me was how often no one wanted that ownership. People prefer help that feels invisible. They resist clarity that makes responsibility explicit. And because I had provided invisible help for so long, the contrast was disorienting. Still, no one challenged me. Because I wasn't breaking rules, I was following them. Parallel to this, I began a quiet logistical preparation. I cleaned up my personal finances, reduced unnecessary expenses, increased liquidity. Not because I expected to be fired, but because I refused to be cornered by timing. I updated my resume, not as a pitch, but as a record. A way of translating years of uncredited labor into language that could travel with me. I didn't post it anywhere. I just made sure it was accurate. I reconnected casually with people outside my immediate work environment. Not to complain, not to network aggressively, just to re-anchor my identity beyond one system. None of this was visible. What was visible was my continued performance. I didn't coast. I didn't withdraw effort. I delivered exactly what was asked. No more, no less. And that distinction mattered. Because when things began to wobble, and they did, it wasn't clear where the wobble originated. Delays surfaced. Confusion appeared around handoffs. Questions took longer to resolve. Not because I had sabotaged anything, but because I was no longer compensating for structural gaps that had been quietly resting on me for years. Leadership responded the way leadership often does when pressure rises, but cause remains unclear. With optics. Suddenly, my name appeared more often in positive contexts. My work was referenced more publicly. There was a subtle shift toward reassurance. That's when the award conversation began. At first, it was informal, a comment in passing. You know, Nora, you've really been a rock for the team. Then a hint. We've been talking about ways to recognize that. I accepted these comments neutrally. I didn't encourage them. I didn't downplay them either. I let the narrative build without investing in it, because by then I understood something critical. Recognition offered after leverage has already been extracted is not protection. It's decoration. The award itself unfolded quickly. An email thread I was CC'd on late. A request for a headshot. Language that emphasized consistency, dedication, stability, all true. All carefully framed to celebrate output without redefining position. I thanked them. I posed for the photo. I stood where they asked me to stand. The photo went live on Monday. Smiling, polished, captioned with words like commitment and excellence. Comments poured in. Congratulations, emojis, public affirmation. From the outside, it looked like arrival. From the inside, it felt like punctuation. Because while they were celebrating a version of me that felt safe, I had already finished moving. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that my silence had reached completion. There were no more internal debates, no more, let's see how this plays out. I had stopped adjusting myself to the organization's comfort. I was simply present, fully, calmly, temporarily. And here's the part that's hard to explain unless you've lived it. Once you are no longer trying to preserve your place, you move differently. You listen without attachment. You speak without urgency. You accept praise without relief. You become very difficult to manipulate. In the days after the award, nothing about my behavior changed. That's what made what happened next so revealing. Because when my access was cut on Thursday at 9:07 a.m., it wasn't because I had faltered. It was because I had become non-negotiable in a system that preferred compliance over clarity. And they moved the only way systems do when symbolism fails. Quietly, procedurally, and without warning. But that moment was no longer the beginning of the story. It was the confirmation, and I was ready for it. The first thing I noticed wasn't the loss of access. It was the silence. No warning meeting, no calendar invite, no message asking if I had a minute. Just a system response where a human conversation should have been. My email froze mid-load. Internal tools failed one by one. At 9:07 a.m., the infrastructure I had supported for years quietly shut me out. What followed wasn't chaos, at least not immediately. Systems rarely collapse on cue. They degrade, slowly, in ways that feel manageable at first. People assumed I was in a meeting, or offline, or busy. By the time someone realized I wasn't responding, the workday had already formed around my absence. Questions stacked up in shared channels. A report was delayed. A dashboard showed numbers that didn't reconcile. Minor things, the kind that usually disappeared by afternoon. Except this time they didn't. I imagine the first wave of concern wasn't about me. It was about momentum, about deliverables, about optics. Someone probably said, "Let's give it a few hours." Someone else likely assumed I'd resurface. I didn't. And that's when the second layer began. Confusion. Not panic yet. Confusion. Because no one knew exactly where my responsibilities ended and someone else's began. Ownership had always been implicit, flexible, convenient. Now it was missing. Meetings were rescheduled, threads grew longer. People started tagging others who had never touched the systems before. Each handoff introduced friction. Each attempt to replicate my judgment revealed how much of it had been contextual, not procedural. Still, no one framed it as loss. Organizations don't do that easily. They frame it as transition, as temporary disruption, as something that will stabilize once roles are clarified. But clarification takes time, and time reveals patterns. By the end of the day, the discomfort had shifted upward. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. Leaders started asking how certain things worked, why timelines had slipped, why no one could give a definitive answer. The question that lingered beneath all of it, unspoken but growing, was simple. How much did she actually do? That's when the consequences truly began. Not for me, for them. Because when someone has been quietly absorbing complexity, their absence doesn't announce itself with noise. It announces itself with inefficiency, with hesitation, with a sudden dependence on meetings instead of momentum. And inefficiency is the one thing organizations feel immediately. By the time my name came up, not in celebration but in problem solving, it was already too late to reverse the first effects. The system was adjusting, but awkwardly, without muscle memory, without the invisible corrections I used to make before anyone noticed. I wasn't watching this unfold. I wasn't refreshing feeds or waiting for updates. I was elsewhere, grounded, prepared. What I felt wasn't satisfaction. It was confirmation. Not that I was irreplaceable, but that I had been carrying weight no one had wanted to acknowledge. And now that weight was visible but detached from me. That detachment mattered, because consequences without a target don't resolve cleanly. They spread. They force reevaluation. They create questions that can't be answered quickly. And in that delay, in that growing discomfort, the narrative began to shift, quietly. By the second day, the tone changed. What had started as confusion edged closer to urgency, not public urgency, nothing that would alarm the broader team, but the kind that shows up in tightened language and shorter meetings, the kind that travels through side conversations and hastily scheduled calls. They were trying to fix something without naming it. Processes were reviewed, access logs checked, questions rerouted. People who had never worked closely together were suddenly paired, trying to reconstruct workflows from fragments. Each attempt solved a surface problem and revealed a deeper gap underneath. That's the trouble with informal systems. They work beautifully until the person holding them together disappears. Someone reached out to HR. Someone else asked whether I had left documentation. A third person wondered aloud, carefully, why no transition plan had been discussed. By then, it was clear, whatever decision had been made, it hadn't accounted for timing. I imagined the moment when someone connected the dots, when the award photo from Monday collided mentally with the access cut from Thursday, when the contrast became impossible to ignore. Recognition and removal are supposed to be spaced out, staggered, softened. This had been abrupt. That abruptness created a problem no one could quietly solve: narrative inconsistency. Attempts were made to regain control of it. There were conversations about reach-outs, about whether someone should check in, about how to frame what had happened if questions spread. The language stayed vague: organizational changes, shifting priorities. But vagueness doesn't fill operational gaps. The real problem wasn't messaging, it was knowledge. People began to realize that what they needed wasn't a replacement, it was context. The kind you only get from someone who has lived inside the system long enough to understand why certain things were fragile and others weren't. And context can't be reverse engineered under pressure. By the time they understood that, it was too late. Not because I was unreachable, not because I wouldn't have answered a question, but because the moment for informal recovery had passed. Any attempt to fix things now would require formality, documentation, approvals, visibility. In other words, acknowledgement. And acknowledgement carries implications. It forces questions about why risk was allowed to concentrate, why praise wasn't matched with protection, why someone essential had been celebrated and cut within the same week. Those are not questions systems like to surface. So instead, they tried to stabilize around the absence. New owners were assigned, timelines revised, expectations lowered. The system didn't break, but it bent. And bending is expensive. What struck me later, when I heard fragments of how that period went, wasn't the panic. It was the regret. Not emotional regret, strategic regret. The realization that a clean exit, one that could have included transition, continuity, even goodwill, had been possible. That by acting abruptly, they had forfeited that option. Whatever trust existed had been replaced by procedural distance. At that point, even if someone wanted to reverse the decision, they couldn't. Not cleanly, not without admitting error, not without reopening questions they had already tried to close. Too many things had been set in motion. Too many assumptions had been exposed. This is the part people misunderstand about quiet endings. They assume they can be softened after the fact, that relationships can be patched if things get uncomfortable. But once a system shows you how it acts under pressure, you don't unsee it. And once a system has chosen procedure over person, there's no going back without cost. They were feeling that cost now. Not dramatically, not publicly, but steadily. And it was irreversible. The conversation happened later than I expected. Not immediately, not in the aftermath. Time had to pass first. Enough for urgency to cool into reflection, enough for the system to realize what it had lost without framing it as a crisis. When the request finally came, it was careful. A neutral subject line, a polite tone. Language that emphasized closure rather than correction. They asked if I would be open to a brief conversation to ensure alignment and tie up loose ends. I agreed. Not because I felt obligated, but because I was curious. We met virtually. Familiar faces, slightly rearranged, no small talk, no overt tension. Everyone was composed, professionals managing an uncomfortable moment with restraint. They thanked me for my contributions. Again. They acknowledged the timing had been less than ideal. They emphasized how much the team appreciated my work. I listened. When there was a pause, I spoke. Not to defend myself, not to accuse anyone, but to clarify. I said I had understood the decision, that I wasn't confused about what had happened, that I had taken steps to ensure my own continuity. That last part shifted the room. I wasn't angry. I wasn't pleading. I wasn't asking for anything. That absence unsettles people more than confrontation ever does. They asked if there was anything I wanted to share, feedback, reflections, suggestions. I chose my words carefully. I said that I had spent a long time being reliable in ways that weren't visible, and that the organization had benefited from that. I also said that reliability without formal recognition concentrates risk. I didn't say you underestimated me. I said the system depended on assumptions. No one argued. There was nothing to argue with. I told them I hoped the experience would lead to better documentation, clearer ownership, and more sustainable structures. Not for me, for whoever came next. That was the closest thing to heat in the conversation, and even that was measured, reflective, almost gentle. They asked if I would be willing to consult informally during the transition. I declined. Not abruptly, not emotionally, just clearly. I said that informal support had been part of the problem and that I needed to respect the boundary created by the decision. That boundary held. The call ended the way it began, calm, polite, unresolved. And that was enough. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph, just alignment, because confrontation doesn't have to be loud to be final. Sometimes it's most powerful when it leaves nothing to push against. I logged off, closed my laptop, and didn't look back. The story was complete, not because everyone understood it the same way, but because I did. Who I am now is quieter than who I was then, but not smaller. For a long time, I thought growth meant expansion, more visibility, more responsibility, more presence. I believed that being seen was the same as being valued, and that if I stayed steady long enough, recognition would eventually translate into protection. It doesn't work that way. What I learned is that clarity changes scale. It doesn't make you louder, it makes you precise. I no longer confuse usefulness with belonging. I don't mistake praise for safety, and I don't assume that silence is neutral, mine or anyone else's. Since then, I choose environments differently. I pay attention to how power moves, not how it's described. I notice who absorbs risk and who is insulated from it. I ask myself early on, is this a place that confuses reliability with permanence? If it is, I don't try to fix it. I don't over-explain. I don't prove myself endlessly. I don't perform stability to earn space. I build alignment first. My work is still calm, still deliberate, still high standard, but it's no longer quiet in the same way. It's documented, scoped, bounded. And because of that, it travels with me. I don't carry resentment from that experience. Resentment would mean I wanted something different from the people involved. I don't. They acted according to the structure they were in, and the structure rewarded comfort over foresight. I acted according to my values. That's the part that matters. I still believe in doing good work. I still believe in being thoughtful, in not escalating unnecessarily, in choosing timing over impulse. But I no longer disappear inside systems that benefit from my restraint without recognizing its cost. If there's a difference now, it's this. I don't wait to be seen before I decide how much of myself to give. That decision happens internally, first. And once it's made, it doesn't need defending. Because quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about authorship over your own position. And that's a form of power no award can give, and no termination can take away. There's a temptation, when a story ends the way this one did, to turn it into a warning or a manifesto, to spell out lessons sharply, to tell people what to do differently, to frame the ending as a victory or a loss. I don't see it that way. What happened to me wasn't exceptional. It was precise. I wasn't betrayed. I wasn't blindsided. I wasn't unlucky. I was aligned with a system for a long time, and then I wasn't. The moment that alignment broke, the ending became a matter of timing, not emotion. That's the moral I keep coming back to. Most harm in professional life doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from convenience. From structures that reward quiet absorption and discourage visible ownership. From praise that feels generous but doesn't change the math underneath. I was named Employee of the Year, and 3 days later, I was gone. Not because the praise was false, but because it was symbolic, and symbols don't protect people when decisions need to be clean. What protected me wasn't foresight or brilliance, it was honesty. Quiet, internal honesty about where I stood, what I was carrying, and what would happen if I stopped carrying it. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I exited with my clarity intact, and that's what I want to leave you with. Not advice, not rules, just a perspective. Pay attention to how systems respond to your silence. Notice whether your reliability is rewarded with protection or simply with more expectation. Watch how often praise arrives after leverage has already been extracted. And ask yourself one gentle, grounding question. If this ended suddenly, would I be surprised or would I simply be confirmed? You don't need to burn bridges. You don't need to announce boundaries loudly. You don't need to dramatize your worth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop compensating and see what surfaces when you do. That's where the truth lives. Not in the applause, not in the aftermath, but in the quiet space where alignment either holds or doesn't. If any part of this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt quietly essential, publicly praised, and structurally exposed, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where recognition arrived too late to change the outcome?